brilliant entrepreneur. Welcome to my office carpet. It's a Podcarpet episode of the Heart Centered Business podcast. And in today's episode, I want to share with you 5 big business failures that ended up being huge wins for me in my business. So I thought it's a good podcast conversation to bring down onto the carpet, to get a little informal, to get a little cash, and share with you behind the scenes of my business and be really upfront and honest about some of my biggest failures. This is episode number 453, which means you can find all the relevant links and the show notes for today's episode over at tashcorbin.com/453. Let's dive in. Hello, I'm Tash Corbin, a business strategist and mentor based on the Sunshine Coast in Australia. The mission of this podcast is to help heart-centered entrepreneurs to make more money and in doing so, change the world for the better. This podcast was recorded on the lands of the Gubbi Gubbi and Ginormous people. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. I find unpacking some of my failures and mistakes in my business to be a very cathartic process. So thank you so much for being part of this little process for me. And I hope that you find it really valuable for you as well. I'm going to dive straight in because I've got 5 pretty ginormous failures to share with you, and I want to share how they became big wins for my business as well. So the first one is the Heart Centered Business Conference. So as you may know, I run the Heart Centered Business Conference every single year now, and I run the virtual conference in March and the in-person conference in Noosa in September each year. And I'll make sure I link to both of those conferences in the show notes of today's episode if you want to come and check those out. But you may not know that the first ever Heart-Centered Business Conference ran at a $27,000 loss. A $27,000 loss. Now, thankfully, at the time, my business was able to sustain that loss. But on paper, that conference looked like an absolute failure. If you were to look at the bottom line of what I created, the work that went into it, the time and energy that I put into that conference, and then to see that it ended up netting me a loss of in the 5 figures, not even $10,000 though, $27,000, you might decide, well, don't run that again. But being in that conference room, I knew I had created the start of something magical. And I knew that number 1, I needed to make it profitable and sustainable for my business. But number 2, it was bigger than just its financial contribution to my business. Because the number 1 contributor to my business all the way up until 2024 financially has always been my Takeoff program. And because Takeoff is an online program with relatively little costs, it's highly, highly profitable. Conference now turns over sometimes about the same, sometimes a little more than the Takeoff program. In 2024, it actually turned over more than Takeoff did, but it doesn't bring in the same level of profits because I have very high expenses with running an in-person conference in particular. The first few times I ran the in-person conference, I didn't even include my time or my team's time in running the conference in its expenses because that would have just blown it out to even bigger losses. These days, conference actually does sustain itself and make itself a little profit. But for the time, energy, and effort involved, I would actually probably be better off focusing all of that time, effort, and energy on running the Takeoff program and launching the Takeoff program. But the more consistently I run the conference, the more it contributes well beyond the bottom line of my business. Conference is responsible for me meeting and growing my network with some spectacular people. Conference contributes to my positioning in the market, and conference also attracts some really amazing guest interviewees and experts into my programs and also onto this podcast. So it contributes to my business in ways other than just financially. But In true Tash style, it was a big failure the first time I ran it. And I'm hand on heart going to claim that and own that it was not done particularly well the first time around, especially from a financial perspective. But it was so magical, and having people in the room together was just so precious to me. It filled our cups in such brilliant ways, and it created other opportunities for me in my business. And so I decided I wanted to run it consistently, and I have. The second failure, which may come as a surprise to you because I just said it was the number one contributor to my cash flow, was my takeoff program. So the first time I launched the takeoff program, I hand on heart expected to sell 75 to 100 spots. I thought I was going to have 75 people at least join the takeoff program the first time that I launched it. Now, why did I expect 75 people to join the takeoff program the first time that I launched it? That's because I was in an online course where that was flaunted about as a very reasonable outcome to expect from doing this online course. And it was pitched in the sales webinar as that was just the normal results that everyone got when they launched online courses. They made $50,000 to $100,000. They sold 75 to 300 spots the first time they launched a course. And so I launched my course and thought I would get the same results. Why wouldn't I? But now looking back at that first launch, I had under 1,000 people on my mailing list. I had under 1,000 followers on my Facebook page. And when I launched the takeoff program, I didn't even do a structured launch. I didn't run a webinar. I didn't run a challenge. I literally just told my audience it existed. That was my idea of launching my online course. I told my audience it existed and I told them there was an early bird price. Then that early bird price closed 4 or 5 days later. And then I talked about it at full price for a couple of weeks and then the course started. That's all I did to launch that course. And I made 13 sales. And it's so fascinating to me to look back on it now because at the time I felt like it was an abysmal failure. I felt like I had completely wasted my time. I felt like everything was just shrinking in front of me because prior to launching the takeoff program, I was bringing in $20,000, $15,000, $18,000 per month in the months leading up to that launch. And so launching the takeoff program, I think the early bird price was like $398. I was expecting to make $30,000 to $40,000 in sales. I was expecting at least $20,000 in sales because I'd made that selling one-on-one services. And at the time, it seemed like everyone online was saying, why sell one-on-one? That limits your income. If you sell one-to-many, if you sell online courses, you uncap your income and you'll make thousands and thousands of dollars more every single month. But I launched the takeoff program. I sold 13 spaces. I made under $5,000 and that was my entire income for the month because I told everyone I wasn't taking one-on-one clients for a while whilst I focused on launching my course. And so what I did was I actually dried up my income and I didn't sell as many spaces as I was expecting. And I'd actually sent out this message telling everyone I wasn't working one-on-one for a while and people thought I wasn't working one-on-one ever again. And so I ended up making a lot of mistakes in that first launch. But now, years and years later, Takeoff is one of the biggest successes in my business. Just because that launch wasn't as successful as I expected it to be, didn't mean that I threw out the program. Just because that launch dried up my income and took me from consistent 5-figure months down to making less than $1,000 the month after my launch, didn't mean that I gave up on my business altogether. Instead, I had to go back to the drawing board. I had to eat a bit of humble pie. I had to go out to my audience and say, oh my gosh, I've made a mistake. And they didn't judge me for that. They didn't say, oh, you're, going back and you said that you weren't going to do one-on-one anymore. Now you're doing one-on-one stuff. They were like, oh my gosh, I'm so relieved I still get to work with you one-on-one. And there were some people who I think were quite gleeful in seeing me fail so miserably. And there were some people who kind of rubbed it in a bit, and that really hurt my ego. But at the end of the day, I knew that my mission for the business and the takeoff program were bigger than the ego and the mistakes that I had made in that first launch of it. So if you were to look at the first launch of the takeoff program, you would have seen it as a failure. If you were to look at the first launch of the takeoff program, you would think I'd made the hugest mistake of my business ever. And to be honest with you, if I could go back and change one thing about my business, it would be delaying the launch of group programs and online courses by at least a year and really solidifying my baseline VIP income, setting up waitlists for one-to-one work with me, growing my mailing list in preparation for my launch, doing all the runway stuff that I teach people to do. But it was able to be recovered, and everything is able to be recovered. I don't think I've ever met someone in business who has made a mistake so big and so terrible with their business strategy that it can't be recovered. But it does take sometimes eating that humble pie, admitting that you've made a mistake, and going back to the drawing board and the basics and foundations, which is what I did to recover for my business. I didn't relaunch the takeoff program for another 11 months, but in that 11 months, I rebuilt the baseline income in my business. I got serious about growing my list and growing my audience. I got serious about generating leads for the program before I launched it again. And I got serious about making sure that the program delivered for the 13 people who purchased it. And I initially hadn't planned to do a lot of live calls with the takeoff program. But I could see after 4 or 5 weeks of people doing the program that they needed a lot more mentorship. It wasn't as simple as just recording a course and putting it out in the world and people will get the results regardless. And I feel like I'd been sold a bit of a false economy, a bit of a false idol in the program that I'd done. It was this like create it once and sell it 10,000 times and make millions and millions of dollars and never have to actually deliver one-on-one with your clients again, never have to actually answer questions from clients again. But I could see that that wasn't necessarily appropriate for a course that was going to help people start a business. Because when you're starting a business, you don't need step-by-step modules on their own. You actually need mentorship. You need someone to bounce ideas off. You need someone to give you feedback on your messaging. You need someone to give you feedback on your offers and ensure that you're sticking to your messaging and your niche and you're not re-broadening out every time someone has an objection to working with you. And that mentorship is something that I love giving people, and it's now an integral part of the takeoff program. But that all came from me recognizing that the model and the launch process I was taught wasn't actually going to deliver the results I was promised. And instead of going, boo-hoo, it didn't deliver, oh, well, I'll go and find someone else to teach me, I was like, no, I know the foundations enough, I know my audience enough, and I know what I'm doing enough to actually find a way to make this work and to retool. And I know what brought the income in the early days of my business, and that was focusing on VIP one-to-one and really getting those foundations nailed. And I could see that there were some big gaps in my foundations that I had let sort of just go on and jump straight into selling online courses when I wasn't necessarily ready for it. So it looked like a failure. It was a failure in the first launch. It certainly didn't grow my business exponentially the way that I thought it would or that I had been pitched it would. But ultimately, it has been a huge success for my business. Failure number 3 is Facebook ads. So my first attempt at Facebook ads was a total disaster. It was the 3rd or 4th month of me being in my business, and it was suggested to me, I had run my first webinar and I had 13 people sign up to my first webinar. And it was suggested to me that if I ran ads to promote that webinar, I could get people signed up for about 50 cents per lead, 50 cents per person signing up for my webinar. And if I'd got 130 or 1,300 people signed up to my webinar, it would multiply my results from that webinar and the sales that I would be making. So I jumped into the Facebook Ads Manager and I set up an ad to promote my next webinar. And when I woke up the next morning, the ad had spent $1,000 and had 0 registrants for my webinar. So I'd set up the ad. I hadn't really done it properly, or I'd done it with the wrong outcome in mind or something. And I'd basically blown through $1,000 in 24 hours. And because of that, it made me very shy of Facebook ads for a long time to come. I'm really hesitant to share this, but actually for 3 years, I never ran another Facebook ad. And that was actually a mistake. I wish I'd got over that a lot sooner and started running ads and running them effectively in the early stages of my business, because back then you could get 50-cent leads very, very easily. Like that was top of the range that you would be paying for someone joining your mailing list, grabbing a free resource or signing up for a webinar. And these days I see people saying if they get a webinar registrant for under $10 per person, they're celebrating and they're really happy about that. And so in those real glory days of Facebook ads where my peers were growing their mailing list by 1,000 to 3,000 people every single month, I was growing my mailing list in teeny tiny numbers comparatively and doing it all organically. Now, that meant that my conversion rate and the amount of money that I made per person signing up to my mailing list was a lot higher because I had a lot more connection with those people. It was done more organically. So, there are pros and cons to both. But actually, these days, running Facebook ads consistently is one of my core foundational things that I do that grows my business month on month on month. And in 2024, I had a reel on Facebook go viral, and I had to turn off my list growth Facebook ads for a little while because I had been running them to a warm audience. And I saw a huge drop in growth of my mailing list, but also leads coming into some of my live launch lead magnets, things like coming to webinars or joining challenges or participating in things like Tashmas. That really dropped off in the second half of 2024 because I needed to stop running those ads. They're back up and running now. They're doing a great job again and contributing significantly to the ongoing growth of my business and in particular my mailing list. So another doozy of a failure that ended up significantly being a win for me in my business. The next one that I want to talk about is my first print run of the Heart Centre Business Planner. So the first ever launch of the Heart Centre Business Planner, I sold it as a digital product only. But I got some feedback from people that first year that they found it very expensive to get the planner printed. They preferred to do it with pen and paper, but to get the planner printed out, it was costing them $60 to $70 because it was $1 something a page to get it printed in colour. So I had a lot of people asking me if I could get them printed in bulk and therefore we would all save money. So the second year of the Heart Centre Business Planner, I decided to get a print run of planners done. I was very smart. I set up a wait list and I had around 200 people sign up to say that they would be interested in getting the Heart Centre Business Planner printed and delivered to them anywhere around the world. So I went and got 200 copies of the Heart Centre Business Planner printed, and then I went out and offered it to people. I think it cost me like $19 to get them printed, and I sold them for $29 plus postage. And some of the postage I didn't even charge how expensive it was because it was quite expensive to get it overseas. And I sold less than 50 copies. I then did a discount offer where I sold them for half price. So it was below my cost price in January. And I sold another 20 or so, but over 100 copies of the planner ended up being pulped and recycled because I couldn't sell them. Wah, wah, another big failure. Now, how did this end up being a win for me? Well, first and foremost, I then decided I would only print to order. So it meant that I had to find a new way of launching and promoting the planner so that I had the exact number I needed before I sent them off to the printers. That's when I started using a Kickstarter to launch the planning system. But in that second year of running the planner as well, what I recognized was that people didn't just need the planner. A lot of people from the first and second year of the planner would fill the planner in, but they needed help with actually implementing it. They needed help with the self-management side, with their productivity, with making sure that they were creating a plan they could actually deliver on, and that the plan didn't just sit on the shelf collecting dust. It actually was something that they used. And so for the third year of the planning system, I actually sold it as a year-long program rather than just selling the planner on its own. And that's really where the Heart Centered Business Planner became the go-to planning system for a lot of people in my audience. Every year, I've had around 100 people or more participate in the planning system, and we've spent the year together. We have the live calls for our yearly and quarterly planning. We have Q&As. We have the Facebook group. We have people form little mastermind groups and pods, and it does a spectacular job of helping people not only have a super clear plan of what they're doing in their business, but actually implement it, actually get it done, and do it in a way that is aligned with their lifestyle goals. Do it in a way that works in with the lifestyle that they want to create, instead of feeling like they're just constantly having to, sit down at their desk and do stuff, and, that's going to be creating something that they rebel against. So it's been responsible for a huge up level of the planning system as well. Another failure that ended up being a big win. The final one that I want to share with you is actually having my 30-day business blast course on Udemy. Now, this is a failure that only recently turned into a win. So my intention when I created that course and launched it on Udemy in 2018 was that it would be a great way to grow my audience. That I would, by launching a low ticket course on Udemy, be accessing millions and millions of potential clients because they have millions and millions of users of Udemy. And I would be able to tap into a new audience and grow my audience by selling them a low ticket course. When I first created and launched that course on Udemy, 99.9% of the people who purchased it were from my existing audience. It wasn't actually getting me in front of new audiences. Now, that's to be expected the first time that you launch it. But something that I saw a lot of people do in the early days of Udemy was that they would create multiple courses, and the more courses they created, the more they would be known as, a reputable provider on the platform. And so therefore they would be promoted more by Udemy itself. The courses would get in front of more of their audience, and then they would grow their user base. There are some amazing entrepreneurs who have grown their audience purely through being a trainer on Udemy. And that was going to be part of my business model moving forward. However, after the first launch, the signups to that course on an evergreen basis were pretty dismal. I had maybe 10 to 20 sales a month come in for the first year or so, and then I'd have 5 sales a month come in for a couple of years, and now I get 1 to 2 sales a month maximum. And part of that is because I don't promote that course to my existing audience too much. I never created another course for Udemy. It always was on the to-do list, but kind of fell down to the bottom of the to-do list, particularly over the last few years when I've been unwell. And I never really tapped into that new audience. It was mostly people from my existing audience who purchased that online course. Now, the reason why this has now become a win is that Udemy are now taking the contents of their courses created by their 100,000, 50,000, however many thousand creators, and plugging it into their own special AI tool to create new courses. So in essence, my understanding is that by offering courses on the Udemy platform, you are also agreeing to have the intellectual property of those courses fed into Udemy's AI tool, which will be creating new courses that don't require facilitators. Those courses will be generated by AI. Now, that's not something I particularly want to be part of. And I'm really grateful that I didn't get my butt into gear and create dozens and dozens of courses on Udemy and grow my audience into tens of thousands of people on Udemy, because there are a lot of people who create and sell courses on Udemy now who are scrambling to get their audiences over onto their own mailing lists and who are closing down their courses on the Udemy platform. Unfortunately, the IP cannot be removed, but the course can be closed to new purchases. And so that's what I'm going to be doing with the 30-day business blast, which brings me to my special offer for this podcast episode. If you would like to do the 30-day business blast, if you purchase it before I take it off the market, you'll have ongoing access to it. So you'll be able to do it whenever you like. I will put with the show notes of today's episode a link to go and purchase the course at the cheapest available price currently. So I'll try and get it for you with the deepest discount we can possibly give you. So if you head to the show notes of today's episode at tashcorbin.com/453, you'll find the link there. But I will let you know that I'm going to be taking that off the market and making it unavailable for purchase as soon as I can after this podcast has been released. I think it's a 30-day notice period. It may be a 60-day notice period, but around that is when, once this podcast goes out, I will be initiating that process to remove this course from the market. So it's an interesting mistake that kind of has led to a win, because it's just saved me a bunch of work and heartache, really. And I'm really glad that I focused my energy and attention on growing my audience in my mailing list rather than doing it through a long form process on someone else's platform. So I'm really grateful that that's where I've been focusing my energy and attention, because a mailing list is an audience asset that you actually own and can move across platforms. If I move from the Kartra platform, I can take my mailing list with me. If I move away from Udemy, I can't take my student list with me. If I move away from Facebook, I can't take my followers with me. So mailing list is such a priority to grow, and I think that's an important foundation reminder for all of us. Now, if that foundation reminder is particularly poignant for you today, I'll also pop a link to my Grow Your Audience freebie in the show notes of today's episode. So you'll find both of those links over at tashcorbin.com/453. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of the Heart Centered Business Podcast. I hope my failures have given you some insights or some inspiration, or helped you to see how things that look like failures at first can often be transmuted into some amazing successes. And until next time, I cannot wait to see you shine. Bye for now.